into this tragic, senseless incident with the full support of my office. Brandon joined our JCSO family on March 18, 2019. He was assigned to our court security division. He's only 26 years old. Brandon received the Medal of Valor at our last awards program. He loved being a deputy sheriff, and he was a good one. I want to thank LMPD Chief Eric Shields, who expressed her condolences early on and for her office of support, and that was like at 3:07 this morning. I also want to express my thanks and appreciation to the Shively Police Department for their quick response and support, and a special thanks to the LMPD Peer Support Unit as well as their Public Integrity Unit. All question about Brandon's employment with JCSO should be directed to Colonel Yates, and all questions about the ongoing investigation should be directed to LMPD. Chief.
Thank you, Sheriff. On behalf of LMPD, I just would like to express the most sincere condolences to the family and to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. This is absolutely heartbreaking, and as the Sheriff stated, wholly unnecessary. Our department is in the middle of the investigation. Obviously, at this time, we have to be very limited with the information we put forward, but we can say with a feeling of confidence that he was targeted and that he was ambushed. And it is just sickening. We will make an arrest. We will make an arrest. And I just can't express my condolences enough to all of you.
Questions for either Sheriff Aubrey or Chief Shields?
Chief, at this point in the investigation, can you say if Deputy Shirley had a tactical vest on or any sort of vest of sorts, bulletproof?
I can't comment to that level of detail, but I think that for police, if someone really is determined to kill you, they're going to kill you. And that was the case here.
Are you able to say whether he was in his car? Did he engage the person? You say he was targeted?
We're really going to allow the investigators to conduct their investigation. My priority is to not say anything that would ever compromise the prosecution. And so while I understand the need and the desire for information, we really have to play this close to the vest until we're at a point that we know we will get a conviction. But thank you.
Chief, are you able to say, obviously there were a lot of businesses in that area, what kind of evidence, video cameras, have you had any luck at that?
We're canvassing the area, and any and all video will be seized.
Do you have persons of interest at this point?
We believe that we may, in fact, have a couple of potential suspects.
Do you know how many times he was shot?
That's a level of detail I'm not going to get into, but I hope you understand.
Chief, do you know how long the deputy had been working at this particular location?
I do not. No. Folks, I realize, there's most of these questions from this point forward I probably just will not be able to answer. I'm just going to turn the mic back over to the sheriff, if that's okay. Thank you.
The sheriff said that the young man had received the Medal of Valor. That's pretty impressive. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
You all recall the incidents of civil unrest last year, earlier this year. During that time, there was a Career Journal reporter that was shot in the head. And Brandon, along with others from the Court Security Division, responded outside, went into the crowd to lend assistance not only to the one that had been shot, but to try to get the shooter who had been corralled by the group, the crowd, to get him, arrest him, and get him to a point of being able to treat him because he was also shot. And so for their actions that day, leaving the security of the courthouse and going into the crowd, he was presented with the Medal of Valor, so along with 3 others. So.
On the 27th?
This was with Tyler Durham.
Yes.
Right.
I'm sorry.
This was the incident in Jefferson
Yes, in Jefferson Square Park, correct.
Can you share any more on how might the sheriff's office support this man's family in this situation whenever something like this happens? Anything moving forward that you can share about how to support?
We have people assigned to the family 24/7. Anything that they need from us, we're working with obviously with LMPD in support of their investigation. But with the family themselves is who our focus is for right now, to get them through this grief the best we can. It's always sad when something like this occurs. We've had 4, I think this is the 5th deputy in the history of the sheriff's office to lose their life while on duty. He is the 4th to be actually shot. We had one die of a heart attack about a couple years ago. So we're totally in support of the family, whatever they need. We will be supportive of the arrangements from here out. Right now, we don't know what they are. It depends on what the family wants is what we'll get.
How does it change things for you guys personally as humans, knowing or believing that he was ambushed and targeted?
Makes it all the more troublesome, obviously. To lose a good deputy is paramount. To lose one under these circumstances makes it more difficult for everybody. So, we have a lot of people in the sheriff's office who knew Brandon well. They'll be dealing with this well as the family and friends of his that's not associated with the sheriff's office. A lot of LPD officers knew Brandon. These guys work together out there on the beat. They see each other in their cars daily, and they get to know each other, back each other up. The brother and sisterhood comes together, and that was never more paramount as it was this morning. When you saw all of the blue and brown shirts all together, that's just what happens.
What was Brandon like, Carl?
He's a young deputy, very active, very proactive, and courageous, good deputy, well liked.
I just wanted to clarify, you mentioned that this was the 5th shooting where a on-duty deputy was killed within the department. Was this deputy on duty or off duty?
He was working an off-duty job in uniform, but he was acting in the line of duty. As a matter of fact, well, I won't go into anything else, but yeah.
I apologize if you already said this, but was he in was he in a marked sheriff's car, or was he in his personal car?
He was in his personal car.
Do you know what kind of car that was?
I don't know exactly.
Chief, do you know? Chief,
I think he owned a pickup truck. Now, whether or not he was in that, I can't say for sure, but I believe that's the case.
Chief, I have a question not regarding the investigation, but just regarding the emotions behind this. This isn't your department by any means, but as Carl had mentioned, it's the Brotherhood, Sisterhood. What was it like to see your officers immediately come together for this? Not necessarily just for the investigation, but, being together and out there to support the Sheriff's Department.
Well, my immediate response when I saw the text was that this could have been our employee, our friend, and my immediate concern is what do we need to do to get the officer's life saved? What do we do? What can LMPD in particular do to make an arrest? I think that grieving comes later. We have a job to do right now, and I need people to be focused, and we have to move forward, and we need to get the subject or subjects in custody. I fully expect our department to support all of the surrounding agencies, and I know that that is the culture of LMPD and the other agencies here, so I have no concern about that occurring. I think it's a natural occurrence. It's part of, as what was mentioned earlier, is it just becomes a part of your brotherhood, sisterhood, because you do know you're on an island when these things occur. But right now we need to keep our focus and we need to make an arrest.
Chief Shields, are you able to say that any stolen cars were involved in this at this time of the investigation?
I cannot comment any further on the actual investigation. I hope you all understand, but the highest priority is for us to get a conviction. And that means putting forward as least amount of information at this time until we have effected arrest and put the investigation together.
Can we
Thank
just
you.
get a confirmation, just if someone could spell it into the mic, spelling his name and just giving us his correct age? Just to
I'm
make
sorry.
sure. If you can just spell his name for us to make sure we get it correctly.
Yes,
and
it's
just-
common spelling, Brandon, Brandon, Shirley, Shirley.
And his age? His age, sir?
26 years old,
Thank you.
and he had been with the sheriff's office approximately 2 years. Signed to the Court Security Division. The other gentleman's been up here, in case you got him on camera, is the major over in charge. He's charge of the Court Security Division where Brandon worked.
One more on that. Was
Major George Grissom, major in charge of the Court Security Division where Brandon worked.
was Brendan married?
No.
Major Grissom, is there anything that you wanted to say about Brandon? It sounds like you knew him pretty well.
He was a hard-working, like Colonel Yates said, he was a hard-working,
Can you step up to the
proactive
mic more?
deputy and really
George.
dedicated to his job and duties here at the sheriff's office.
Can you repeat that?
George,
to the
could you
mic?
come over here, say that?
Brandon was a hard-working, proactive deputy, really dedicated to his duties at the sheriff's office. And everybody liked him, and he was a good person. He was good to be around.
Thank you, Major Grissom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Sorry for your all's loss.
Thanks. Thank you, Chief.
All right.
Thanks for being here. Thank you very much for all y'all do.
Call anytime.
Your people this morning without saying, I just couldn't say enough good about them.
Anytime.
Yes, sir.
We'll leave that there.
Thank you. You bet.
All right, so you just watched the. Hold on. Never mind, they cut it. So early, around 2:30 this morning, a Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, that's Louisville area, a Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy who was working security at a car lot, uniformed security, but he was off duty. He was executed. He was ambushed and executed, and they killed him. And it's just another one of the prime examples of these executions of police officers that are taking place across the United States. It's insane. It's insane. I looked him up because and it looks like he was an EMT with the city of Louisville prior to joining the sheriff's department. As you heard, he received, what was it, a Medal of Valor for taking life-saving or attempting to take life-saving measures for the journalist who was shot in Jefferson Square Park during the riot or the Louisville BLM protests. Man. It just always happens. Always. So I'll update the article because I wrote one this morning very quickly, and I'll update it once we find out a little bit more information. But apparently he was sitting in an unmarked vehicle. He was uniformed. That's the new detail we didn't have before. When people came up and ambushed him in the vehicle and shot and killed him. And then they brought him to the hospital to take life-saving measures, but they were unsuccessful. Insane. And then you have people like Cori Bush yesterday saying, or this morning, whenever it was, saying we need to continue defunding the police. It's insane. Insane. There's going to be a hearing that's going to start in a minute. I don't even really want to cover it, to be honest. It's the second part of that hearing that we covered the other day, examining the threat of racially motivated blah. I'm going to put that one up now because it just started. We'll watch that.
By domestic terrorism and the impact it has on communities all across our country. Today, we'll continue to examine this grave national security threat and hear from experts representing community as well as research organizations, as well as former government officials about the evolving nature of this threat and how the federal government can better address it. The information we gather from these two hearings will lay important groundwork for a September hearing with current government officials, including FBI Director Wray and DHS Secretary Mayorkas, about what actions our federal agencies are taking to deal with the rising threat of domestic terrorism. I'd like to thank each of our witnesses for joining us today and for their work in the public and private sectors to protect the American people. I look forward to hearing your analysis of rising domestic extremism and your recommendations to ensure we are effectively tackling this deadly threat. On Tuesday, we heard examples of horrific attacks and the roots of that violence from faith-based civil rights, academic, and policy research organizations. The witnesses discussed how this rising violence has affected Asian Americans, Black, Latino, Arab American, and so many other communities, as well as the disturbing rise in anti-Semitic and other faith-based violence. The testimony we heard made it crystal clear that too many Americans are living under the threat of terror, intimidation, physical violence, and that should cause concern for every American. We also heard testimony about the role social media has played in amplifying and spreading hateful rhetoric and misinformation that contributes to increased violent attacks motivated by ethnicity, race, religion, and politics. I look forward to building on that testimony today and continuing to dig into what domestic terrorism data the federal government tracks, whether we should be examining additional authorities, and how we can establish enduring federal policies that will put an end to the violence that is terrorizing our communities. With that, I would normally turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for his opening statements, but he is engaged right now in some negotiations related to the infrastructure bill that is before us in the Senate. In fact, we'll have additional votes on that legislation coming up approximately 11:30. I expect the Ranking Member Portman to join us, and he'll be making his comments at that time. But we will move on to hear from our witnesses. As you can see, we'll have members coming in as well. It's a very, very busy. Senator Hassan is here promptly, as she always is, and Senator Portman has now arrived. So,
you know what? I'm going to do something real quick because, well, I have to. So let me change this. Because, you know, we cover these deaths, the shooting deaths and all this stuff all the time of police officers. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to talk about something that I talked about the other day. The last day on my show, there were some protests that took place in Stanton, Virginia, and I was trying to think of a way to write it. For anyone that doesn't know, Stanton, Virginia, we've written 5 or 6 different articles on them so far. On Monday, things took a turn for the worse in Stanton because now they have... The Augusta County Sheriff's has been arresting people for using bullhorns outside of their facility and then trespassing them from that property. So instead of protesting outside of the Sheriff's office, they've started marching and protesting outside of the Augusta County the courthouse in Stanton. Now, things that are a little bit interesting about what's going on, and for anyone that doesn't know what's going on in Stanton, Virginia, a small rural town, go to our website, citizenstringer.com, and search for Nexus, Nexus, and then you'll find 5 or 6 articles that we've written on this, because it's really confusing when you think about it. There are protests that are taking place in Stanton, Virginia that are part of a television show. They're not real protests. In the past couple of weeks, though, everything has kind of gotten worse, I guess is the only way to say it. Things have gotten crazier. The other day they had apparently a white supremacist, and I say apparently because I don't trust the people there. So apparently there was a white supremacist Nazi guy that sucker punched people, and he was charged with a hate crime. I know he was charged with a hate crime. I wouldn't put it past them for hiring someone to do this just for their show, similar to the guy that ran up with the knife that they were never able to identify. They then, as this guy was arrested for sucker punching one of the people that had surrounded him, again, it still was a sucker punch, but he was definitely surrounded. when that happened, all these people took to social media, all the BLM crowd took to social media and saying that they're under attack by Nazis and all this. And so new protesters started showing up. Now, these protesters are from Richmond, Virginia. And many of you guys may have seen these videos or seen some of these pictures. Like, so you saw this guy here. Now, one of the things that's interesting about it, so this is Warren Cash. He is someone that's here. He's a business owner. He's a local business owner. He owns a gym. And he's gone out and started protesting against these BLM crowds that are protesting there because he supports the police. He supports law and order, and they're being wrong. So as you can see here, this fella behind him, is blowing smoke on him and standing clear. So I decided to dive into these people and who they actually are, and I'll get to that in a minute. But you can see here his camera was attacked. There again, that guy, and we have all their names, and I'm going to say them right now. And then you can see this guy see him in the background. He's chasing after the flag. There's a thin blue line flag that was on someone's truck, and then they came off they took it off. Hold on. Let me put this back up for now. So, man, it's just so dumb. Man, why is this camera focusing? Sorry about that. It's so stupid what's going on in this little town, and the fact that the police are, I don't know what's going on. I'm like completely phased out. I think of my setting on the camera, or it's because I don't have the lights on, so it's losing my focus. But these people, we already know who they are. Which is the most concerning portion of all this. You know, I started writing it this morning. I'm just going to get to it real quick because I don't even know what to write anymore. I mean, we know they're fake, and we know these people are you know, insane is the easiest way to put it. But like this guy's name. The guy in the white t-shirt that has the gun slung around his chest, his name is Demarice Wyatt. He's 26 from Richmond, Virginia. See, what's interesting is he's apparently on probation on a 10-year bid for grand larceny. And plus, he's got a slew of other charges, but he's currently on probation, and yet he's got a gun strapped to his chest. Now, maybe it's not a real gun. Who knows? Maybe it's just not a real gun. But that is concerning to me as well because, one, he's a career criminal. He's got charges going back to 2017, 2018, or probably before that, too. A slew of charges, including in the past year, a lot of protesting charges, just like the other guy, Jafari, where they have the same thing. I don't know who that guy is in the back, but I'm curious to see that. But so this guy in the back is from Richmond. This guy here, he's also a convicted felon. His name is Fletcher Ray Boyd. He's also 26 or 27. I don't care. But this guy's really interesting, too, because he's apparently on probation as well. And he originally faced charges for breaking and entering with the intent to rape somebody. That was his original charge. Now, that was pled down to like pickpocketing or something like that, another felony conviction. So you have an alleged rapist that's out here protesting. You've got other, people that it's so weird what's going on in this town. And then the third guy, which I don't know if I have a picture of him, who is going to be wanted. I don't know if the arrest warrants have been issued yet. So again, this guy that's trying to drag the flag off of the back of that car, he's a convicted felon. He's got a gun strapped to his chest. In front of the police station, it's almost like people don't care about it. That's him. That little fanny pack that he's got around his chest apparently holds a pistol. And then the guy behind him that you see wearing the black as well, I have his name. I don't have it written down right now, but I have his name as well. And he's also a convicted felon, but it looks like he may be homeless. So maybe they were able to get some homeless people to come out here and protest as well. That's what it just doesn't make any sense. So his name, again, he's oh God. Hold on. So his name is Kenyon Hardy, also from Richmond, Virginia, also has a slew of charges, including, that's why I don't believe he's got a gun on him, because he's also not allowed to possess a weapon. But this is what's going on in this little town. And now there are apparently, or if they're not out yet, there's going to be arrest warrants for all three of the people that I just mentioned for assault or for property theft. And maybe they can get this guy for illegally possessing a gun. But I've reached out to BLM 757 because I'm trying to find out if these guys are all part of that group. And so I asked BLM 757 in an email this morning, is it their habit to get other protesters who are convicted felons and alleged, what do you call it? It was alleged rapists or prospective rapists? I don't know. Breaking and entering with intent to rape while having a firearm with him too. That's what that little guy, Fletcher Boyd, was being charged with. These are and these are people that apparently I can see why they have a vendetta against police, because they're career criminals. But now look at what's happening because the inaction of the police departments and all that stuff. Maybe these guys have all gotten away. Granted, they'll probably have arrest warrants for them pretty soon, but they're not there anymore. They're apparently there's a protest today at Norfolk at 3:00, and I'm going to be watching that feed, and I'll call the Norfolk PD and say these guys got arrest warrants, because this is the problem. These guys need to go to jail, and they need to be locked up for a long time. And just as everyone else does, that's participating in this sham protest that's taking place there, they just don't for some reason. There's no holding them accountable at all. And so a little town in Virginia is getting overrun by these people that truly don't care. They're doing it for a show. The Black Lives Matter 757 guy, he doesn't care. I've got messages with him back and forth about how he's getting these free phones from Nexus. And I said, how can you work with a company like that? And he's like, well, are you going to pay for the phones? There's something seriously wrong with what's going on. And my fear is, and this is the reason why I keep talking about it, is my fear is someone will die. Someone will die and stand. A protester will either take, matters into their own hands, or counter-protesters are going to show up, and someone will end up being killed in this little town. And when that happens, the people involved should sue everybody, because I've been trying to raise awareness to what's going on in this little town for over a month now. And mainstream media doesn't care. Local media is only presenting one side. They're only presenting the protest side down there, which is really frustrating to me as a media guy. You would think you would portray what it is. And they're just not. They're just not at all. But it's very frustrating to me. So hopefully all three of those guys get arrested. And hopefully they get, they can trace back who is paying for this whole stuff. And there's more too, and I'm not even getting into that now. Someone said, is the little town getting paid to turn their heads onto what's going on? I have no idea. I have no idea whatsoever. My advice to everyone was just keep your heads down. As of now, it's not safe to go out and counter-protest there. It's not safe to do that, because now they brought in all these outside agitators that clearly just want to fight people. They don't care. They're all convicted felons that apparently don't go to jail. The one guy's got a 10-year bid for grand larceny, but he does 1 year and then has 9 years suspended on probation. What? I don't understand our judicial system whatsoever. And now the camera's faded out into obscurity. I don't know why it's doing that. I guess because the lights aren't on, and it's dark in here. But I'm trying to hydrate. I saw a couple of comments about how I'm feeling. I'm still not really feeling that good, but I'm feeling better than I was. What the hell? Look at this fade. It's like blocked completely. Whatever. Anyway, let's go back to this hearing. I don't know what's going on with my camera. It can't get it at all. I don't think it can see because the light's not on. It's just getting even more blurry. And then it goes, what the hell is going on? Anyway, I'm going to put this hearing back on for everyone so we don't learn anything.
Violent extremism in our country is simply too big for the security community to fix. We must call on other parts of our society to reflect on their contributions to our current moment, and all of us need to work towards a more responsible discourse that allows for disagreement without dehumanizing our opponents, and we must always strongly and quickly condemn anyone that suggests violence is somehow justified to achieve one's goals. Where and how do we start? This almost sounds too simple. but the research has borne it out repeatedly. We start locally. We start with our families and with our neighbors. The greatest disruption to the grievance cycle that leads to violence begins by loving our neighbor as we'd like to be loved ourselves. Thank you for your time and your leadership. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. Our second witness is Ms. Maya Berry. She is the executive director of the Arab American Institute, a national civil rights nonprofit organization that promotes civic engagement and legislative advocacy on behalf of the 3.7 million Arab Americans living in the United States. As executive director, she works to expand Arab Americans Institute's capacity to combat hate crimes and protect the rights of securitized communities. Ms. Berry established AAI's Government Relations Department and, I may proudly say, as a Michigan native, also served as legislative director for U.S. House of Representatives Minority Whip David Bonnier. During her time at Capitol Hill, she managed legislative strategy with a focus on human rights, immigration, civil rights, and liberties and trade. Welcome, Ms. Berry. You are now recognized for your 5-minute opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for convening today's hearing. August is a difficult time for many communities. This week it was the 2-year anniversary of the El Paso shooting. Next week marks the anniversary of the hate crime murders of Khalid Jabara and Heather Heyer, of whom a recent law is named after. And today marks the 9th year since the shooting at the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. I'd like to begin by my testimony by saying the names of those who died on this day 9 years ago. Satwant Singh Kalaka, Parmjot Kawar, Savik Singh Kastara, Parkash Singh, Ranjit Singh, Sita Singh, and just last March, Baba Punjab Singh, who was wounded during the attack, died from his injuries. These names, of course, don't include the victims injured, including Lieutenant Brian Murphy, who was shot 15 times while defending those inside the Gurdwara. I believe it's important to center victims and communities in these conversations, and I thank you for including the perspective of the Arab American community, one targeted not just by ethnically motivated violence, but a community that experiences the harms of profiling and expansive and often overly broad counterterrorism programs and policies. It is in that context that I want to emphasize 3 points that I hope inform our discussion today, beyond what I provide in my written testimony. First, I believe it is imperative that we have a shared understanding of the threat we face. Attorney General Merrick Garland, Homeland Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas, and FBI Director Christopher Wray have all testified before you with complete clarity. White supremacist violence poses the most lethal threat to our safety. It may be characterized under a new category of, quote, racially motivated violence. But we are talking about violence inspired by white supremacy. Even before the recently joint FBI-DH document on domestic terrorism provided some analysis, an FBI official in a letter in May of 2020 to Chairman Benny Thompson stated that as recently as the first quarter of fiscal year 2020, approximately half of the FBI's domestic terrorism disruptions, quote unquote, were arrests of racially motivated violent extremism, but all but one being white supremacist violence. Our work has often centered around the need for better data for both hate crimes and
hold on. Listen to what she just said. Half of the first quarter of 2020. So they're talking about a 45-day period. So January into February. So how many incidents were there? It wasn't a lot, but I could tell you if they actually analyze the data from May of 2020 until currently, the majority of the attacks that have taken place on the United States streets, including the attack that claimed the life of an officer this morning, those are not white supremacist attacks. Everyone doesn't want to be honest with what's going on. We have a problem with people being racist and attacking people in this country, but it's not white people. Let's be honest with that.
Transformed criminal justice system, Congress should act to provide additional oversight to safeguard the rights of individuals and communities. The considerations of policy and legal responses to acts of white supremacist violence, which, depending on the specific circumstances, might also fall in with the definition of a hate crime, are made exceedingly fragile by the fact that Americans' constitutional rights hang in the balance. Finally, the public discourse on these issues matters. Speaking out against hate and bigotry makes a difference. We must isolate this hatred that fuels this violence. We must shame it. And hearing it or excusing it for it emanating from elected officials, including the presidential bully pulpit, did extraordinary harm to all of us. While I'm not suggesting there is a direct correlation, even the universally accepted underreporting of the federal hate crime statistics showed an increase in hate crime in the lead up to the 2016 presidential campaign and during the Trump administration. Words have consequences. We saw it in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, where then President Bush stood up and said, do not scapegoat an entire community. We saw the different impact after these most recent incidents. And back to where we started. Every single data point is a person, a family, a community. It is a core belief of the Arab American Institute that for our country to live up to its ideals, we must ensure strong and civil rights and civil liberties protections for all. I hope our deliberations today move us in the direction of enhancing the safety of all communities, especially the most vulnerable to this violence, while protecting the rights of all. Thank you again for your oversight convening this hearing today.
Well, thank you, Ms. Berry. Our third witness is Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League, an organization committed to stopping the defamation of Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. During his tenure at ADL, he has worked to modernize ADL's operations and enhance its ability to counter hate crimes. Mr. Greenblatt oversees ADL's Center on Extremism, which analyzes and monitors extremist and hate groups. Launched Never Is Now, the world's largest summit focused on anti-Semitism and hate, and created the Center for Technology and Society, which targets the rising tide of online hate and harassment. Prior to joining ADL, Mr. Greenblatt served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Director of the Office of Social Innovation. Mr. Greenblatt, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Portman, members of the committee, and my fellow panelists, good morning. It's an honor to appear before you today to address the dire threat posed to this country by domestic terrorism and violent extremism. For more than a century, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. To deliver on that mission, we've done many things, including assemble a world-class team investigating extremist threats from across the ideological spectrum. And unfortunately, those threats are on the rise. At the top of the pyramid of hate are the most extreme incidents, like what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh almost 3 years ago. The massacre of Latinos in El Paso, Texas, that took place 2 years ago this week. The murder of Heather Heyer at the neo-Nazi rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, 4 years ago next week. The Pulse nightclub shooting against the LGBTQ community just over 5 years ago in Orlando, Florida. And as previously been noted, the attack on the Sikh Gurdwara in Oak Brook, Wisconsin that happened 9 years ago today. Over the last decade, 429 innocent victims were murdered at the hands of extremists, the overwhelming majority of whom were far right extremists and white supremacists. But we also know full well that you don't have to be an official card-carrying extremist to cause harm. The problem we see is that violence motivated by hate and anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry increasingly has been normalized. ADL researchers found that 2020 was the third highest year on record for anti-Semitic incidents since we began tracking this data in the 1970s. Of these, known extremist groups or individuals inspired by extremist ideology were responsible for 16% of the total number of incidents. That's a lot. But as I said, anti-Semitism clearly is not the sole domain of extremists. We saw this past May as the violence between Israel and Hamas escalated, a drastic and disturbing rise in anti-Semitic activity across America, including almost a dozen anti-Semitic assaults in public places like Times Square or in a boulevard in Los Angeles where people are eating dinner, or in a main thoroughfare in Las Vegas, and attacks on Jews simply walking down the street. And this isn't Germany in 1931. We're talking about the United States in the year 2021. But this matters not just because of what's happening to the Jewish community. As I've said before, and I'll say it here again, very often hate might start with the Jews, but it never ends there. Bigotry begets more bigotry. Hate leads to more hate. For example, between March 2020 and this past February, the Asian American and Pacific Islander community experienced nearly 3,800 incidents of hate, 11% of which were physical assaults. And in 2019, the FBI data showed anti-Latino hate crimes rose nearly 9%. So why is the threat on the rise? To boil it down, we believe that this movement has been fueled by two catalysts. The first are leaders who have repeated extremist rhetoric, co-opted their conspiracies, and knowingly or not have given them the green light. And make no mistake, this is coming from some who have had the highest levels of office, and also from people in positions of authority across the ideological spectrum. Neither side is exempt from intolerance. Second, social media. It is a super spreader of hate. You can find it with just a few clicks right from your phone. Intolerance is increased and amplified by algorithms that invisibly induce users further down the rabbit hole of radicalism. It's all unacceptable. We've been urging at ADL, pushing the tech urgency to take meaningful action for years, simply to enforce their own terms of service, but they failed to do so. That's why we've also called on policymakers like you to finally hold them accountable for their role in enabling the spread of extremism. Deep and dramatic reform of Section 230 is essential to this process because the law should not exempt them from accountability for from their products and services. The time for action against the extremist threat is now. We need an all-hands-on-deck approach from government and really a whole-of-society strategy to combating domestic terrorism and violent extremism. That's why ADL has created a framework, we call it the PROTECT Plan, to mitigate these threats while safeguarding civil liberties. There's a lot more detail on this in my written testimony. Happy to speak to it during the question and answer session. But we believe these steps can have an immediate and significant impact in countering domestic terrorism. More so than any single action or policy or law, there is simply no silver bullet. Now, we were glad to see that the administration recently released the first ever national strategy to counter domestic terrorism, which closely actually tracks to our plan. But today I'm here to urge you to do your part in implementing these strategies and to meet the moment. As part of this, you need to rethink DHS for the modern era, making sure it's best prepared and organized to address the threat of domestic terrorism. And I know it's somewhat beyond this committee's jurisdiction, but again, I would implore you to strive for Congress to take serious action against the social media companies. Members of the committee, as you work to address the concerns around domestic terrorism and violent extremism, we urge you to remember that the way these threats tear at the very fabric of our communities and our country. For ultimately, this is not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. It's an American problem. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. Our next witness is Mr. Brian Levin, a professor of criminal justice and director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, a nonpartisan independent research and policy institution. As the director of the center, Mr. Levin leads the organization's efforts to examine and analyze hate crimes, terrorism, and legal issues. Mr. Levin is a court-certified expert on extremism in the United States and in England, He is the author of The Limits of Dissent, which is about the Constitution and domestic terrorism. Mr. Levin, welcome to the committee. You may proceed with your opening comments.
Chair Peters, Ranking Member Portman, Senator Hassan, Senator Padilla, California Zone, if I may, and other members of the committee, as well as the heroes of the U.S. Capitol and D.C. Metropolitan Police Departments. And as a former NYPD officer, God bless every one of them. Thank each of you for your service to our nation and for another special opportunity to present some of my latest analysis and findings on hate and extremism, which Congress has used since 1987, when I was 10. I am, as you've heard, with Cal State San Bernardino Center and the Criminal Justice Department there, but my testimony today will address material trends related to the threat posed by racially, religiously, and politically motivated extremism. The extremist threat today, both domestically and internationally, is in a state of significant realignment across several fronts, and it is also severe. As I have noted for several years, white supremacists and far-right extremists continue to pose the most lethal domestic terror threat facing the United States, but they do so in an increasingly diversifying landscape that impacts not only these malefactors, but various emerging actors across the entirety of the extremism spectrum. Indeed, we are seeing an era of a democratization of hate. Recent headlines across North America illustrate this. A 189% spike in anti-Asian hate crime in major U.S. cities that we found in the first quarter of 2021. A diverse group of over 550 defendants in the Capitol siege, violent confrontations at the local level around hot-button issues, including at school board meetings and at congressional hometown conferences. Also, increasing activity of militias of various stripes, bomb plots and hoaxes by incel misogynists, an anti-Semitic attack previously referenced in Times Square, and the emergence of a years-old KKK plot against a black man by Florida corrections officers, just to name a few. And it's occurring elsewhere in North America. In Canada, anti-Asian hate crime also rose amidst another mass homicide against a Muslim family and a spate of church arsons. Well, unfortunately, our 2020 data is not looking good. California, Texas, and New Jersey are up, for example. But the increases vary by location. Extremist homicides, while down, and I think that was a temporary anomaly with respect to the various COVID restrictions, still showed a diversification going on. Indeed, the first hard left homicides we saw were last year. In many years, 2021, New York City up 135%, LA up 53%, just year to date. Anti-Semitic hate crimes up significantly. For instance, in New York City, we saw more anti-Semitic hate crimes, or just about as many rather, in 3 weeks in May than the whole first quarter. And indeed, New York City and LA look like they may be heading for records. Similarly, anti-Asian hate crimes up triple-digit percentages both last year and the first quarter of this year. 2020, according to the FBI Director Wray, hate crime investigations up 63%, 370 alone, just with the FBI. 2019, record hate homicides by the FBI. And by the way, it would still be a record even without the horrifying El Paso massacre of just 2 years ago. As we've seen with respect to El Paso and others, we're seeing a confluence of folks, mass killers, some very young, who have access to weaponry. There is an overlap between hate crime and terrorism, but we are seeing violent conflict also rising around conflictual political events, which I've documented in the appendix. Indeed, extremism is a carnival mirror reflection of mainstream stressors. And we have seen this again and again and again, not just on January 6th, but in October of 2018 when we saw a cluster of extremist homicides right around the election. August 2017 was the third worst month of the decade for hate crime. And it peaked in the 6 days of and after the very fine people statement by the president. But November 2016 was the worst month for hate crime in 14 years, and the day after the election was the worst month till June 2003. Online invective around this is up too. So we see this feedback loop of invective on the internet, some influential political leaders, and then hate crime rises, and sometimes terrorist plots and attacks around these events, these convergences. I have a litany of suggestions which I'd be happy to talk to later as my time is ending. But I want you to understand that today's terrorist is increasingly less ideological and organizationally rigid. We have an elastic reservoir of grievance, and targeted violence and hate crimes often overlap. So we need data that is timely and deep. And we have not had that in many years. And I hope the Senate acts on these various proposals that I have at the end of my testimony. But again, we are seeing a very disturbing change, and the risk is severe, not just from the leaderless resistance that I warned about to Congress back in 1995, but this dissipation of extremism that is becoming more regional and more idiosyncratic in its manifestations. I want to thank the committee so much for the privilege of once again sharing our important data and highlighting the severe risk that our nation is facing with respect to domestic terrorism. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ms. Berry, your organization has been at the forefront of protecting the Arab American community and navigating the domestic terrorism threat in the post 9/11 world. You have voiced your opposition to the creation of a new domestic terrorism statute during your opening statement here today, and you noted your concern that additional authorities could potentially adversely impact civil rights and further harm communities of color. So my question to you is, if additional authorities are not the right approach in your estimation, what should the federal government be doing to counter this threat while at the same time balancing civil liberty concerns?
Thank you, Chairman Peters, for the question and the way that you reframed it, because I think that is the key question. The reason we believe that a new charge is not necessary is that there are existing 57 different statutes that apply to crimes that meet the definition of terrorism. Of those, 51 apply to both domestic and international terrorism. So from our perspective, there needs to be a different approach that understands the threat that we face today. I think one of the most important things that's happened, frankly, is the change during the recent election is that we are actually discussing it as the problem that it is. The Biden administration did release a strategy. While there's a lot there to think about and address, and I think congressional oversight will be key to talk about its implementation, the fact that we are now taking it seriously enough for a strategy to be issued is important. The FBI had not released data on domestic terrorism since 2005 until the report that they released recently in May of 21, just this year. So I think we do see an uptick now in what is happening, and that is looking at this threat that is posed and trying to determine how to best address it. I think that 20 years after the horrific attacks of 9/11 is a good time for us to reevaluate what was passed with the Patriot Act, look at the sunset provisions that were put in place, and say, does it make sense for us to sort of double down on the counterterrorism approach that we've taken? I will share with you, Mr. Chairman, that I was doing a press interview once about this very topic, and the reporter kept saying, so I don't understand, you oppose a new charge. And I said, yes, sir, and I explained why. And he came back to, so what you're saying is, doing to white supremacists what was done to your community, that's not something you want? And my answer was, sir, our approach is about dealing with the violence that puts us at risk, our country and all of our communities. I saw a community, both Arab Americans, American Muslims, and others, whose rights were violated under this setup. So from our perspective, no, I don't want other Americans' rights violated. I want the violence addressed. I want our First Amendment protected in that process. I want our Fourth Amendment protected in that process. I want to hold constitutional protections while we go after the very real threat that communities are facing.
Thank you. Ms. Newman, in your opening comments, you suggested that we do need additional authorities. After listening to Ms. Berry's comments, I mean, I hope you take those in consideration as you answer this question, is why are the government's current tools not enough to combat this threat in your estimation?
Thank you for the question, and I imagine that Ms. Berry and I actually agree on a lot more than where we vary. I too believe 20 years post 9/11, it would be a really great idea for us to reflect. A lot of mistakes were made. In my written remarks, I note that we have more terrorists today than we did on 9/11. That's very sobering as a counterterrorism person. I thank the Lord that we haven't had another 9/11. That is a success that we should all be proud of. But there are some costs to that, and one of those is that I found it really jarring in recent months to hear from people like Ms. Berry and the Brennan Center and other communities. You had panelists on Tuesday who basically said, this is how I interpret it, I don't trust the government to not abuse any new tools we give them. That should cause us all to pause. And I'm not in government right now, but I associate with it, and I think that means that we need to reflect. We didn't get some things right in the last 20 years. So I fully agree that we should reassess. At the same time, I look at the way the law currently treats similar crimes, if done in the name of a white supremacist ideology versus in the name of ISIS. Those crimes are treated differently. Now, my colleagues former colleagues in the government, they are doing their darndest the way the laws are written to go after the threat. They take the threat seriously, and they recognize the perils of what it would look like to try to open up this conversation and talk about changing the law. They recognize that that's very difficult. So they're doing the best they can with the tools that they have. I would think that it would behoove us as a people to have a commission that looks at this problem, looks at our mistakes, updates the law and on all sides, not just for domestic terrorism, but we've got to do counterterrorism better. And I think from an equal justice under the law principle, the laws need to be right-sized so that we're treating the same crimes the same, regardless of the ideology. And the second thing I would point out is that domestic terrorism ideologies are increasingly global in nature. And that gray area is posing challenges for our colleagues in the executive branch, trying to know where that line is. Having Congress say, here's where the line is, would be better than them guessing.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you have warned about political rhetoric from our leaders, noting in a Time magazine article that, and I'm going to quote you here, leaders must be aware of the impact of their position on civic and social cohesion. Otherwise, terrorists will gain strength in the cracks that divide us, end of quote. Could you describe the correlation between political rhetoric and spikes in violent incidents against racial, ethnic, and religious groups to the committee?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, it harkens back to President Lincoln's first inaugural address, where trying to keep a country together, he said, to appeal to the better angels of our nature. And you know what? He was right. He might not have been effective at that time, but his words have sustenance. Let me give you an example. 6 days after 9/11, President Bush, a conservative person of goodwill, went to the Islamic Center of D.C. at 3:40 in the afternoon and decried the violence against our Muslim American brothers and sisters. You know what? Hate crimes dropped precipitously the next day, according to FBI day-by-day ticks. And it dropped precipitously into the new year. We went from 481 to just over 100 in those 2 years. But the very next day and into the next week, Conversely, our community was attacked in San Bernardino. Everybody got together. Everybody. The Muslim community raised money. We had interfaith. Do you know what? We had 0 hate crimes in the city of San Bernardino. But that wasn't the case for the rest of the country. We saw a significant increase from about 0.67 per day to about 2.5 per day. And then 5 days later, candidate Trump made the terrible proposal of a Muslim ban. And hate crimes against Muslims increased another 23%. Let me just add, by the way, Arabophobic hate crimes went up too in both instances. The issue is words matter, particularly when it's coming from leaders. Interestingly enough, when President Trump launched his campaign and spoke derisively about Latinos, during a very tight news cycle where major candidates were about to launch and we had the Mother Emanuel massacre, hate crimes against Latinos did not go up. But once he became first in the polls and he made statements with respect to various communities, we saw absolute correlations. And we saw it again last.
It's all Donald Trump's fault if you haven't figured that out. Every single day we will hear his name for the rest of our lives.
In a feedback loop that is fed online, then certain influencers take this bigotry, and then when you have it from the top, boom. And we saw that in 3 distinct clusters last February and March with anti-Asian hate crime. It's something that we see demonstrably again and again, and I gave you the figures with regard to these election times, a clustering of extremist homicides around the conflictual midterms, as well as an increase in hate crime. Indeed, the first worst month of the decade, November 2016, and the day after was the worst day for hate crime going back to June 2003. Second worst month, October 2018. And then, tied for the third worst month, was August 2017, the month of Charlottesville. But the hate crimes peaked and the 6 days of and after the Very Fine People statement.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Levin. Ranking Member Portman, you are recognized for your questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate all the testimony today. Ms. Berry, I understand your view on laws that can be misused. But one thing I just want to be sure that we are connecting the dots on here. This is the committee that's supposed to do the oversight over Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. And we had a lot of discussion today from Ms. Newman about what was called the Office for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention that you were with previously, and now it's called the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships. In your written testimony, you talked about the fact that you thought that was an ineffective and even discriminatory office. You did not talk about that today, and you guys have not had a dialogue on that, maybe on purpose. But again, our job, as I said earlier, if we can get more to solutions in this round of testimony, that would be great. Can you guys have a discussion about that? Like what's wrong with having an office or a center that focuses on that? And Ms. Newman, you were there, so I'll let you respond to Ms. Berry. But Ms. Berry, if you could just give me your views on that. What are your current views on that office or the center?
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman, for the question. The comments in my statement refer to programs primarily under the Obama administration and into some of the time under the Trump administration known as countering violent extremism programs. We take a very cautious approach, shall I say, to approaching prevention programs because what we've seen in practice to be primarily ineffective approaches. I didn't take the position of directly opposing in my statement the CP3 programming or the new TVTP. And I'll tell you that, Senator, that's because it's early in the process. We have had 2 briefings. They've talked a great deal about the new Colorado model. I'm interested in hearing more about it. But what we have found historically is there's 2 reasons for us to be concerned. The first is the efficacy of these programs. Frankly, as an American taxpayer, as someone who has concerns about how we spend our tax dollars, where those efforts are, and in times when there's great deal for need to appropriately fund good programs, I worry about radicalization theories and the ideas that we can step in and prevent this type of violence. I'll leave that to the experts, but I do think that there's a lot of healthy skepticism about what's possible. The second part of the concern that relates directly to the CVE programming previously, and as I said, we'll cautiously ask for congressional oversight over these programs and look at them, is that they were highly discriminatory in targeting specific communities. We were led to believe that a young American Muslim teenager who was probably going through some issues needed to be, for example, referred to their school counselor on a different track and different oversight. We had the FBI create a website called Don't Be a Puppet that was really problematic for many reasons. There's a lot of the CVE programming that was highly I think irregular and discriminatory. And it didn't stop with targeting the American Muslim community. We went from countering violent extremism to this concept known as BIE, the Black Identity Extremism, which is a completely fabricated issue. So we have real concerns about what prevention programs have looked like and are willing to see where they're going. But the reality is there needs to be a great deal of oversight.
To your response, Ms. Zimmer, because we need to have that, and thanks for doing it in an expedited way because there's so many issues to get into here. It sounds like you're saying we should not reauthorize it or authorize the CP3 program without adequate oversight, but are you saying that we shouldn't authorize it at all? Just yes or no?
At this time, I would say no. Okay.
Ms. Newman, what is your response to that?
Again, I probably agree with more than people might think of what Ms. Berry said. The early iterations of CVE, there were multiple instances where, in my view, it was abused, that it was at times, and I don't know that those that set it up intended it to be this way, but at times in certain locations in the country, it basically became a tips and leads program for the FBI. And if you know anything about radicalization processes and how you might move somebody to build resilience so that they're not vulnerable to radicalization, or you're trying to move somebody off of a radicalization pathway, inserting law enforcement into that dialogue usually doesn't help. It closes off, and we saw this, right? The communities, the very communities that we needed to be partnering with did not trust the FBI because of other factors that had nothing to do with CVE. You add CVE to the mix, and it just didn't work in multiple locations. There were other places where they piloted efforts, not necessarily coming from the federal government, and over time they figured out what worked. And when I came back into government in 2017, it was the thing that everybody loved to hate. Republicans thought that it was based on pseudoscience and that it didn't work, and Democrats thought it was a tool to target the Muslim community. And we were kind of left, when you're new in a job, trying to figure out what's the ground truth here. We had some extra money, so we punted. We asked RAND, our FFRDC, to study it for us. They produced a 300-page report. They talked to experts all around the world and other countries who have been doing prevention. Sorry, sir. The bottom line is, I think what we have produced now learns from the mistakes that we made and is based on evidence that it does work. That said, I've been very clear, and when I briefed you guys 2 years ago, we're trying something new, we're innovating, because what we have tried for 20 years hasn't worked. So we're going to make mistakes. We need to be transparent about those mistakes. We need civil libertarians at the table helping us do this. Two main differences from the past: it is not law enforcement led, and it's locally based. It's not driven out of Washington.
Okay, well, thank you. And I know this is a complicated area, and I don't mean to rush the discussion, but I'm getting close to the end of my time. You quoted Ben Franklin earlier. Afterwards, Mr. Levin quoted Abraham Lincoln. But Franklin's admonition is correct. I hope everybody agrees with that prevention is the best approach here if it would work. In other words, trying to avoid these hateful acts, avoid what's happening online, as we talked about earlier, through prevention. And what you're saying is it's the social science around that has been difficult. And you say the RAND study validates the fact that this prevention effort was somewhat successful, but it could be more successful if you use different kinds of tools, including different kinds of leadership and different roles for law enforcement. But I think prevention is absolutely critical, and we have to figure this out. And again, this is a committee that's supposed to be providing the oversight over not just that program, but the entire department's effort in this realm, and we have the lead on it in the Department of Homeland Security. So I really want to work with the people on this panel today and with the chairman and others to be sure that we have an effective prevention program. We've talked about the international terrorism issue more than we had the domestic terrorism issue relative to prevention, but obviously both are incredibly important. And I think to Ms. Berry's point, it can be money very well spent if it's spent effectively. And by the way, to the law enforcement point, and again, I want to hear Mr. Levin later. I guess you'll have to get it for the record now because I'm over my time. Give me your data on law enforcement and government officials generally being subject to these attacks, because the data we have from Tuesday is that the single highest number of attacks are actually on government officials and law enforcement. So it's a broad issue. And I just end with one final point. In the Somali community in Columbus, Ohio, law enforcement developed a good relationship, and particularly one officer. And they were able, as a result, to prevent an attack from happening. I mean, literally, someone had the steps in place to initiate a terrible attack that would have killed a number of people. And because of a tip and because of working with the Somali community, the community stepped forward. Obviously, the leaders in the community were adamant about not having this kind of activity, certainly terrorist activity, in their midst. And so they worked with law enforcement to provide the information. It's one of the few examples we can point to in America where we actually know that law enforcement worked with the community responded, and we were able to avert a terrible attack. So I do think law enforcement can play a very effective role at the local level in an appropriate way, in this case by developing those relationships. And I think that may be one of the single most important effective things that we can do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Portman. Senator Hassan, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Portman, for your leadership in holding this hearing, and to all of our witnesses today. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for your testimony today. I want to start with a question to you, Ms. Newman. The testimony we've heard this week illustrates the clear threat posed by different types of domestic terrorist movements. However, we can't lose sight of international terrorist threats, and I want to ensure that DHS has the personnel and resources needed to address both types of threats. So based on your time with the Department of Homeland Security, how should the department think about resource allocation to ensure that it is positioned to analyze and confront all types of evolving threats, including threats from domestic terrorists, foreign terrorist organizations, and homegrown violent extremists?
Thank you for the question, Senator. That was certainly a struggle for us in the past three years that I served and during the Trump administration. But let me break the question down into two areas. There's the work that we do at DHS that is about empowering our partners, helping our partners, usually state and local governments, private sector, to perform their preparedness function missions. So that's prevention, protection, response, recovery. We give grant funds for that. We set baseline capabilities for that. And I spent most of my comments talking about prevention today because that was...
Driven by the more transmissible Delta variant, cases are continuing to rise. These cases are concentrated in communities with low vaccination rates. In fact, over the past 7 days, Florida and Texas have accounted for about 1/3 of new cases and more than 1/3 of new hospitalizations nationwide. In 7 states alone, Florida, Texas, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, states with some of the lowest vaccination rates, account for about half of new cases and hospitalizations in the past week, despite making up less than 1/4 of the U.S. population. Vaccinations are the very best line of defense against COVID and the Delta variant, and we're doing everything we can to keep getting shots in arms. And we are seeing results. Over the past 24 hours, we've recorded 864,000 vaccinations, the highest in a day since July 3rd. And importantly, 585,000 first shots. That's the highest since July 1st. For the 4th week in a row, we've increased the daily average number of Americans newly vaccinated. And importantly, we're seeing the most significant increases in states with the highest case rates. We've more than doubled the average number of people newly vaccinated each day over the past 3 weeks in the states with the highest case rates. In fact, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Mississippi are now vaccinating people at a pace not seen since April. And other states that have been lagging in vaccinations are also picking up their pace. Tennessee has seen a 90% increase in first shots over the past 2 weeks. Oklahoma, an 82% increase, and Georgia, a 66% increase in first shots over the past 2 weeks. Clearly, Americans are seeing the impact of being unvaccinated and unprotected. And they're responding by doing their part, rolling up their sleeve, and getting vaccinated. In addition to getting more shots in arms, we are spurring action on vaccination requirements. Last week, the President announced new vaccination requirements for all federal workers and federal contractors. And he called for strong vaccination requirements from the private and public sectors to help protect lives and keep our economy strong. Already, we're seeing momentum in vaccination requirements across the country. Businesses know vaccinations are a way to keep their workers and customers safe and to keep their doors open. And today, Yelp is announcing a new feature that allows consumers to search for businesses with fully vaccinated workers or businesses that require proof of vaccination to enter the business. Small businesses across the country are stepping up. A recent study shows that half of America's small businesses are likely to require their employees to be vaccinated. Just this week, Safran, a family-owned business in New Orleans, announced their staff is 100% vaccinated, and they are requiring vaccinations or a negative test for all their customers. Tuesday was Safran's first night of service under their new rules, and the owner said the community response has been overwhelmingly positive. At the same time, nearly 650 colleges and universities are already requiring on-campus employees and students to be vaccinated. And yesterday, leaders of America's historically black medical schools decided to mandate COVID-19 vaccines for all of their medical students. Nationwide, over 100 hospital and healthcare systems, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, are requiring vaccinations for their healthcare workers. In fact, just this week, more than 30 healthcare employers, including Kaiser Permanente, one of the country's largest, announced vaccination requirements for their healthcare workers. So America's businesses, large and small, universities and medical schools, and many other institutions are stepping up on vaccination requirements. And our message is quite simple. We support these vaccination requirements to protect workers, communities, and the country.
So dumb.
As we double down on getting more Americans vaccinated, we're also stepping up our work to help states experiencing rising cases due to the Delta variant. Our COVID-19 surge response teams are now working with 16 states to address their specific needs. We have deployed hundreds of federal personnel to provide in-person support to address a range of needs, from increased testing to getting shots in arms through mobile vaccination clinics, to encouraging more physicians to use antibody treatments, to helping states address hospital capacity issues. Let me close with this. From the beginning, we have known that this virus is unpredictable. And we have been relentless in our efforts to get people vaccinated. Our whole of government response will continue its relentless efforts to end this pandemic and deliver progress each and every day. With that, let me turn it over to Dr. Walensky. Dr. Walensky.
Good morning, and thank you, Jeff. To keep things brief, I will simply give you an overview of the data and the state of where we are as a country. Yesterday, CDC reported 103,445 new cases of COVID-19. Our 7-day average is about 89,463 cases per day. This represents an increase of 43% from the prior 7-day average. The 7-day average of hospital admissions is about 7,348 per day, an increase of about 41% from the prior 7-day period. And 7-day average daily deaths have also increased to 381 per day, an increase of more than 39% from the previous 7-day period. We saw 614 new deaths reported to CDC on Tuesday. 83% of our counties in the United States are experiencing moderate or high transmission, with Delta variant continuing to be the predominant circulating virus. Across the board, we are seeing increases in cases and hospitalizations in all age groups. Those at highest risk remain people who have not yet been vaccinated. Now is the time to get vaccinated. We know these vaccines are working, and we know they save lives. Thank you. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Fauci.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walensky. I just like to spend a minute or two addressing a concern that I continue to hear regarding the speed with which the vaccines were developed. And this is usually among people who have a degree of vaccine hesitancy or reluctance to get vaccinated. It really relates to two things that have gone on that people need to appreciate. One is the logistics and the investment in resources that was made, and others is the decades of basic and clinical research that antedated the development of the vaccine. What about the logistics and the resources? Generally, when you develop a vaccine, the thing that usually takes years to do, you do it in a sequential fashion. In other words, in order not to waste money, as it were, you do something preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then you start manufacturing the product. You do that sequentially because if the first one doesn't succeed, you don't want to go to the second, third, and fourth step. Because of the wise investment in Operation Warp Speed, and we give credit to the Trump administration for doing this, particularly Secretary Alex Azar, who was an important component of that. What you did was make an investment to prepare for phase 2 and phase 3, even before you knew the phase 1 worked or not, and to start manufacturing. So when you do that, you make a major investment in resources. If the vaccine doesn't work, you've lost a lot of money. If the vaccine does work, you saved a lot of time. And that's exactly what happened. In addition, we had the clinical trial sites that we had built decades earlier for HIV and influenza, which were used to do the clinical trials. And third, unfortunately for us, but fortunately for the vaccine trials, we were in the middle of the summer surge when the phase 3 trials were initiated. So next comes the decades of basic and clinical research, both in platform technology and immunogen. It didn't start in January of 2020 when the sequence was put on a public database. The data, the experiments on mRNA approach, which was funded predominantly by the NIH and also industry was involved, started decades earlier to develop an mRNA molecule that could be used as an immunogen for a vaccine. In addition, the vector-based approach, such as the one that J&J did, was again done 10 or 20 years earlier with HIV. And the now very, very elegant work of the development of an immunogen that would be highly immunogenic to get the kind of high efficacy and effectiveness that we got was work done at the NIH Vaccine Research Center and by many of our grantees over the previous literally 1 to 2 decades. So when people say, I'm concerned that this went too fast, it did not go too fast. It was a major investment, both in the logistics, the resources, and the clinical and basic research. So I'll hand it now back to you, Jeff.
Let me hand it over to Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy?
Well, thanks so much, Jeff. And it's great to be with all of you again this morning. I think we all know as cases have risen across the country due to the Delta variant, there are Americans who are wondering what this really means for them and their families. And today I want to emphasize one fact that remains true, and that is that the vaccines are working against the Delta variant. They are highly effective at preventing severe disease, hospitalization, and death, and they're also effective at reducing the overall risk of infection. In fact, a recent study in the New England Journal of Medicine found that 2 doses of the mRNA vaccines are 88% effective against symptomatic COVID-19 infection with the Delta variant. So breakthrough infections in fully vaccinated people are the exception, not the rule. And when they do happen, the vast majority are mild or asymptomatic. Now, this reflects the reality that we have the most effective tool we need to keep us safe and end this pandemic, and that is a vaccine. And recognizing the importance of continuing to push our efforts to vaccinate the nation, yesterday, we brought together the 6 living former Surgeons General of the United States from the Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump administrations to discuss our public health COVID-19 response, with equity being at the forefront of our conversation. It was a historic meeting for a historic moment. And these former Surgeons General are public health leaders who have been friends, mentors, and partners to me in my years as Surgeon General. And we spoke about their concerns about health misinformation, about the importance of ensuring that communities of color and rural areas aren't left behind in the vaccination effort, and the power also of engaging trusted community-based organizations in vaccinations. We will continue to work together in the months ahead to ensure we continue to increase vaccination rates across the country with equity as our guide. And finally, this gathering of Surgeons General reflected the diversity of our nation, and it was emblematic of what we have to do together to defeat the virus. As SGs, we came together from different backgrounds, serving under different political administrations to work together on a path toward ending this pandemic. And we all share the belief that science and public health are what will help us protect our nation from this pandemic. So thanks for your time today. I'll turn it back over to Jeff for our Q&A.
Well, thank you, doctors. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions. First question.
First question, let's go to Cheyenne Haslett at ABC News.
Hey guys, thank you for taking my question. We know that boosters are still under consideration, but there's more openness to acting on them for immunocompromised people faster. So can you tell us when can immunocompromised people expect those boosters will be available, and are there any updates?
Dr. Fauci?
Yes, thank you for that question. As we've said and continue to say, immunocompromised individuals are vulnerable. The reason is that it is clear now from the observational data that was made that they do not make, in general, with some exceptions, but in general, do not make an adequate response that we feel would be adequately protective. So in this regard, it is extremely important for us to move to get those individuals their boosters. And we are now working on that and will make that be implemented as quickly as possible, because for us and for the individuals involved, it is a very high priority.
Next question.
Let's go to Ouija at CBS.
Thank you so much for taking my question. Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky have both warned that the virus may mutate and perhaps into a strain that is powerful enough to evade the vaccine. Is there any way to gauge how long before the virus overtakes the vaccine? And so we understand what that means for the vaccine. Is there a way to tweak it in that situation in order to give us protection?
Why don't we start with you, Dr. Fauci, and then Dr. Walensky, if you have anything to add.
Yes, there is a very, very long-standing tenet in virology that viruses cannot mutate unless they replicate. And so the easiest way to prevent the scenario that you're proposing could happen would be to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we possibly can, to not allow the virus to continue to circulate in the community, giving it ample time to mutate. Now, not every mutation is going to result in a functional change, but every once in a while, you do get a series or a constellation of mutations that do that, and you get a functional change, the way we have seen with the Delta variant, which functionally changed because it became significantly more able to transmit. We have within our power to prevent that. And you prevent it by not allowing the virus to freely circulate, finding vulnerable targets. You protect the vulnerable targets, who are unvaccinated people, by vaccinating them. And when you do so, you do a very, very strong blocking of the evolution of variants that could be problematic.
Next question.
Let's go to Sharon Lafreniere at New York Times.
Thank you. Many experts say that the falling antibody levels that Pfizer and today Moderna cite as evidence that booster shots are needed is not convincing because people may still be protected even with those. If that's so, what is the right signal? Is it vaccinated people ending up sick enough to be in hospitals, and can the government wait for that kind of evidence before making a decision? And then secondly, I wanted to ask, what are the chances that the Delta variant will burn out, so to speak, here in a month or so, like in India and the UK?
Dr. Walensky first.
Yeah, we're going to make the decision about booster shots based on a compilation of evidence, one of which will most definitely be the immune responses, as you note, but that is not necessarily known to be a perfect correlate. The antibody responses, our immune system also has T cell responses. So this is going to be a combination of evidence, both of neutralizing antibody data, as well as clinical trial data, as well as our cohort data that monitor the safety and the effectiveness of our vaccines in many different populations across the country, tens of thousands of people, essential workers, healthcare providers, long-term care facilities, people who've been vaccinated early in the process. And it will be a combination of all of that evidence that helps inform our booster strategy.
Dr. Fauci, the question of the case count and
Right.
quote, go ahead, please.
Right. So what you're asking is, when are we going to turn around this acceleration that we're currently experiencing with Delta? There are two ways you do that. You do it in the immediate sense right now by mitigation, and mitigation of the kind of things you've heard from the recommendations of the CDC regarding masking, regarding avoiding situations, crowded situations where you can have the increased capability of the virus to spread. The ultimate end game of all this is vaccination. And that's why we continue to harp on that in a very, very proactive way, that if we continue to vaccinate and we get that 93 million people who are eligible for vaccinations, who have not been vaccinated, if we do that in the immediate, intermediate, and long term, and do the mitigation right now, we will turn the Delta surge around. I will guarantee you that that will happen if we do what I just outlined.
Next question.
Caitlin Collins, CNN.
Thanks so much. Several of you and the president have repeatedly cited figures saying that 99% of those who die from COVID-19 are unvaccinated, and 95% around that are who are hospitalized are unvaccinated. With the Delta variant, do you still stand by these numbers, and do you have government data to back them up?
Dr. Walensky.
Yes, thank you for that question, Caitlin. So those data were data that were from analyses in several states from January through June, and didn't reflect the data that we have now from the Delta variant. We are actively working to update those in the context of the Delta variant. I do want to reiterate, though, that based on the data we're seeing, and we don't have fully updated numbers, universally, as we look at our hospitalizations and as we look at our deaths, they are overwhelmingly unvaccinated people.
Next question.
Let's go to Tamara Keith at NPR.
Thank you for taking my question. There's some reporting out there that the working groups that are looking at reopening some international travel are making plans to require vaccination for international visitors. I'm wondering how that would work, whether it would be simply an attestation as with federal workers, or whether there would be a more rigorous form of vaccine verification. And on vaccine verification, you talk about that restaurant and other businesses that are requiring their customers to be vaccinated. How are these businesses supposed to do vaccine verification? Is it Wild West out there, or are there guidelines?
Why don't I take the first question on travel and Dr. Murphy, vaccine verifications. In terms of travel, and I'm glad you asked that question, the administration certainly understands the importance of international travel. And given where we are today, as Dr. Walensky showed us earlier, on the prevalence of the Delta variant, the United States will maintain the existing travel restrictions at this point. However, we do have, as you alluded to, agency working groups that are developing plans for when we do open travel. How do we do it in a consistent and safe way? And part of that planning is a phased approach that foreign nationals traveling to the United States may, there's still policy work being done here, may need to have some type of vaccine requirement, but that's not a decision at this point. That's one of the paths that's being looked at and considered, but there are alternative paths being looked at the same time. So the interagency working groups are currently developing a policy process, and we will be ready when it is the right time to consider reopening travel, and that'll be guided, as always, by the science and the public health. Dr. Murphy?
Sure, and let me just ask, can you repeat the specific question you had on the verification?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting myself.
It's okay.
The question is, you guys have talked about restaurants or other private businesses having only vaccinated customers. How's a mom and pop shop supposed to know how to do vaccine verification?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, the good news is that we have seen a significant movement in the private sector to develop essentially vaccine verification efforts. We know this is not something that the federal government is leading, but we are happy to see the private sector leading and taking initiative on that. And I think this is going to be increasingly important because we know that more institutions are considering vaccine requirements. We certainly have seen that in the healthcare system, the vaccine requirements for healthcare workers is being adopted by more and more institutions, and we expect that will continue.
Next question.
Maureen Grappi at USA Today.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I wanted to ask about the federal assistance being offered to states that are hit hard by COVID. At one of the White House briefings this week, Jen was asked if the offers have been accepted in Florida and Texas, and she called that a, quote, discussion. Is there any update on that, on whether Florida and Texas want any of the help that the administration is offering?
We are working with 16 states, and I believe there are conversations with Florida. I know there are conversations with the state of Florida, and I believe there are some conversations with Texas too. But let me come back.
A truly brilliant person, and a great colleague to work with. I'd like to say that about Senator Thune, with whom I'll be joining in a Bible.
Negotiating with hateful groups. That was Attorney General Merrick Garland in his testimony before Congress. I think the focus ought to remain on the violence and not the ideology. I understand why those who want to engage in prevention programs.
Well, thank you. This is a question for Dr. Walensky, I think. Last week in the slides we saw from the CDC noted that Delta may cause more severe disease than older strains and cited some evidence from other countries. I'm wondering, does CDC think the data show it does cause more severe disease? And also, how are you looking at the risk it poses to children? Do you see more severe disease from Delta for them?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Meg. Certainly in that slide deck, there were some early preliminary studies that suggest that Delta may potentially cause severe disease. We continue to monitor this, not just in adults, but also in children. But I do want to highlight a couple of things that continue to confound some of the data, and that is we have an enormous burden now of disease, so exposures are much higher. And the mitigation strategies that were used last summer, even in the winter, have not been employed in many of these areas that we are having surges right now. So we're working to understand the differences between exposures, and as well as the severity of disease, and working to confirm those preliminary data that might suggest so.
Good. Well, thank you, and look forward to briefing early next week. Thank you.
That can be applied as we consider policy today. I'd like for you both, please, to weigh in on how we might structure that kind of thing.
Thank you so much, Senator, for your comments and your question. Even during our hearing today, part of the conversation when we were talking about this would suggest that my community is a partner in the war on terror, right? We are not a partner in the war on terror. We're not the front line of counterterrorism policies. We're a community that have been targeted by hate crimes. We're a community that has been targeted by government policies that have had a disparate impact on us. If we see a crime, we report it because we want to be safe. We want our children to be safe. That goes without question. That's not different in any other way. In terms of the oversight piece 2 decades later, I think one of the most important pieces, I was a congressional staffer on 9/11. And I was in the room because I worked for a member of the Democratic leadership, Congressman David Bonnier. I was in the room when the then Attorney General John Ashcroft brought up the Patriot Act. And I know that it passed. Members have admitted it passed without a full reading. And the idea was that we would put in sunset provisions and revisit those and look at what kind of impact that they've had. Regrettably, when we talk about these issues through a national security frame, it suspends our ability to understand and process the civil rights and civil liberties concerns. It's regrettable that that takes place, but that is what takes place. And historically, it's been Arab Americans or American Muslims. More recently, we've seen the Asian American community being subjected to some pretty unfortunate national security discriminatory policies as well. It expands the South Asian community. So I think it's imperative that we one of the recommendations I mentioned specifically in terms of Department of Homeland Security oversight that your committee has, that we look at requiring a mapping program of the type of data that the Department of Homeland Security collects on all of us. How does it retain it? Who does it share it with? What does it do with it? We don't know that information. And I think it's critical if we're going to have community trust. I mean, the reason we have to take a skeptical approach to all of this is because of the practices and the abuses that our community has seen. So we have to do better to keep all of us safe, and that requires trust in government. We don't have that for good reason. The oversight that you all can provide is a critical piece of that.
Thank you, Ms. Berry. And Ms. Newman, if you might concisely on what such a review of those policies might look like, with due respect, just want to make sure I can get a question to Mr. Levin as well.
Of course. It was in February 2020, I was testifying over on the House, and I actually called for a bipartisan commission to look at both the past as well as what do we need to do about domestic terrorism. So it was before the present experience that we've all gone through of January 6th and quite frankly, the spike that we kind of knew was coming, but COVID hadn't happened yet. We didn't know how bad it was going to get. But part of the reason I called for that is because we could see, to borrow the phrase, the system blinking red, and we could see that the current structure of the authorities impeded our ability to go after the threat with equal measure. And there was I believe, a bill that was put into the NDAA and made it all the way to, my understanding, the December conversation where you're trying to get things out the door, and then it was removed from the bill, so it did not pass, and I believe that was unfortunate. I had hopes that the January 6th Commission might be able to do something similar. It looks like we're not going to have a January 6th Commission, so I still think it would be wise. This is extremely complex, as Ms. Berry has pointed out. You need experts from the intelligence community, from the operators that do counterterrorism. You need experts from communities that have been on the receiving end of the effects of these policies. it is nobody in the executive branch ever has enough time to be thoughtful and to dig into all of the whys. A lot of things are under resourced, and that's part of the reason you don't see transparency, because nobody has time to be able to be transparent. So there are absolutely, in my view, without getting into anything classified, ways in which we could improve the way the government functions on the international terrorism side. And I think we fundamentally need to fix that, because clearly we have lost the trust of our citizens. And then maybe that gives us an opportunity to also look at how do we right size and deal with the domestic terrorism measures as well.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. And Mr. Levin, you've spent some of your testimony today and answered questions about underlying factors, the conditions that have emerged that have increased the level of threat, both of hate crimes and violence that may be committed by domestic violent extremists. And we've talked about social media, and social media is often discussed. Is social media really more of an accelerant and a vector, or do you see it as a cause? And given that we've seen these dynamics emerge simultaneously in Europe and in North America, what, in your view, are the underlying social and political and cultural conditions that are driving radicalization and sectarianism in diverse societies that, in which we can only flourish and coexist when we cohere?
Excellent question. Thank you so much, Senator. First, I do not believe that we need a new broadly applicable domestic terrorism law. Just want to go on the record with that. We can improve certain things, and I'm going to tie it to your question. For instance, 18 U.S. Code 231 et sequence punishes only trainers in violent skills to foment a civil disorder, but not trainees. In your home state, Atlanta counted one hate crime in 2019, and the head of the Klan in Maryland and Delaware just started a militia in your state, and he's taken photographs of people running for office. And what we have seen is a broad reservoir of grievance. And what social media does, I think it's a combination of cause and accelerant. Let me tell you what I mean. Pew has found we are the most polarized we've been in decades, and now we're seeing other surveys showing we're even fragmented within that polarization. And what happens, what social media allows, is these subcultures. So you have this big grievance, whatever it is, and it ends up going to the lowest common denominator. So for instance, people who were in favor of gun rights, nothing wrong with that. But what is created is a category of villains who are demonized within a subculture, and then you have that cascade down to people who not only believe I have a right to own a firearm if I'm a law-abiding citizen, to one that says the insurrectionist doctrine of the Second Amendment, which even Scalia in Heller said is not good, which says that I have the right to armed rebellion with those weapons. And what happens is you see these bubbles that start off, and it might be a person in a community or a county or a region, and he'd get no support, or she would get no support. But online, these big social media platforms allow it, and then it cascades down. And we need to have some serious recognition about the role of social media. And I think at the very least, I think we all can agree upon, if they put up certain requirements for themselves, I think they need to report on it annually, as our Bill 587 says in California. How are they doing? Another thing, transparency. Facebook just this week said, cut off NYU from doing research. You know what? If you want to use the information superhighway that was created by our tax dollars, you better make sure that you're applying the rules of the road. So I think it's both a cause and an accelerant, particularly because, one last point, the declining trust in the communal institutions that hold us together. My son did a beautiful chart that's in the appendices about all that going down, and guess what? Congress is at the lowest.
On that note, I yield.
I didn't mean that rudely. My mom wants me to be civil.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff, for your questions. Mr. Greenblatt, I want to go back to you to give you an opportunity to weigh in on the discussion that we had prior to Senator Ossoff's questions on what we're seeing in terms of acceleration. But I also wanted to ask you about data, and the ADL does a fabulous job in collecting data. I introduced legislation that was signed into law requiring the FBI, the DHS, and the ODNI to track and publicly report data related to domestic terrorism, and unfortunately, their response is late and woefully inadequate. So I'd also, in addition to your thoughts on the previous discussion, if you could speak to the importance of having the federal government capture comprehensive and reliable data on domestic terrorism, I'd appreciate if you could handle or tackle both of those questions, please.
Sure. So why don't I start with the question as it relates to, again, social media? And I think there are just a couple things. I've talked about this already. There are just a couple things to note. I think, first and foremost, the First Amendment, as we've talked about it, doesn't apply to commercial environments. There's plenty of precedent in Supreme Court decisions which make that very clear. Even that being said, in public spaces, states and state-controlled spaces, all speech isn't permitted. You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. As I said before, slander, incitement to violence, that's not permitted. All that being said, we need to be willing to tolerate hateful speech online, but the trick is to keep fringe ideas on the fringe and not to elevate them algorithmically, not to monetize them with advertising, and to take down threats to persons based on their sexual orientation or their faith or their religion or their gender. ADL released a report card literally last week that noted the failure of the big tech companies to do this consistently and in a timely manner. And it's absolutely untenable. One of the steps that I think we could see that Congress could take would be the creation of a clearinghouse, a bit like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, an independent clearinghouse where extremist content could be stored, if you will, so that the companies, when we see extremists, and it's already been mentioned by my fellow panelists, they move from platform to platform to platform. We can better manage that threat and mitigate it. If we had an independent clearinghouse was collecting this data, so it's all being shared. I would also just say, to the issue of transparency that Professor Levin just mentioned, the failure of the companies, we'll talk about the government in a minute, but the failure of the companies, particularly Facebook, to provide any transparency into their data is unconscionable. No other industry, literally no other industry, behaves this way. And we don't even know about the content that gets taken down. There is no independent verification of their data. So organizations like mine and others are unable to track it effectively. So this is just a very big problem. I would say specifically as it relates to data on domestic terror and violent extremism, indeed, we need the federal government to be more forthright and to see coordination from the agencies, like which you mentioned, Senator Peter, in sharing data about acts of domestic terrorism and violent extremism. There are academic centers like Professor Levin's at UCSB, and there are organizations like ADL and the SPLC and others that try to collect this information. What we have done is created tools, like on our website, you can see the ADL HEAT map, which stands for Hate, Extremism, Anti-Semitism, and Terror. And we're using data visualization to make it easier for individuals and scholars and journalists and experts and ultimately policymakers to understand the patterns of extremist activity and hate crime so you can drive better policy. But we would be so well served if the ODNI and DHS and the FBI would do more to make it easier for us to understand the threat. And I think some of the content, Senator Peters, in the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act literally tries to get at this problem.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. And I want to take this opportunity just to thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today, for providing us your expertise. I will say that your testimony has been both alarming, but clearly essential for us to hear, and we need to be focused on this issue. And it's my commitment, and I think members of the committee here, that we will continue to be focused on this issue in the months and years ahead. Both of this week's hearings have contributed pertinent information for our committee to better understand what needs to be done to combat this most lethal and serious national security threat. I look forward to continuing to examine terrorism threat and the actions that need to be taken to ensure that we have a comprehensive and enduring counterterrorism policy that effectively takes on white supremacists, anti-government, and anti-Semitic violence here in the United States. That effort will continue, as I mentioned earlier, in September with our annual threats hearing before this committee. I will note that the record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on August 20th of 2021 for the submission of statements and questions. For the record, this hearing is now adjourned.
Interestingly enough, I decided to quickly look at finish my lunch. I decided to quickly look at ADL's heat map, and just looking at the 2020 stuff that is or 2021 stuff. What it appears to be, it's just propaganda, and they're using this Patriot Front group, which leaves flyers all over the place. So they have a ton of this stuff is so wrong. I'll be honest, like the majority of these are all Patriot Front. Yonkers, Worcester, Wallington, Seattle. They're just writing on walls or handing out flyers, and they're using those as hate incidents. I wouldn't be surprised if I wouldn't be surprised if Patriot Front was Antifa. Like if it wasn't like, do you know what I mean? If it was just a propaganda arm, wouldn't be surprised at all. I don't know. It's just stupid. We're not going to learn anything new. All right. So what I think I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut the feed. Jen Psaki was supposed to speak at 1. You know she's going to be late. She's always late. I'm still sick. The headaches are gone for now. I'm drinking a crap ton of water. So I'm probably not going to do a show tonight, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But with that, I think I'm going to end this. If you're watching on PTNN, another show will start for you here in a second. Everyone else, we'll see you soon.